I read a comment the other day that street fights are to the death.
Very extreme, but also I understand the premise behind the point.
I do, and I completely agree that there are no rules in a street fight, but there are still limitations to the way that we'll behave.
Right, in a street, there's no way you can say to someone, oh, you can't do that, that's not okay. Physically speaking, literally speaking, in the fight context, there are no rules. However, rules exist without us knowing about them.
Exactly, and these rules are psychological boundaries that we have within ourselves.
They're not written on the wall, but you know them inside yourself.
Is it fair to take a baseball bat to an 80-year-old woman? Most people would cringe.
Yeah, it's a horrible thing to even imagine, but that's the point right there, is that people say there's no rules in street fights. Why does that make us cringe?
And street fights are to the death.
And street fights are to the death. So why does it make us cringe to imagine someone battering an old lady?
Exactly.
So as soon as we change the parameters, there are rules to street fights.
Exactly, and that's the point.
I think people want to imagine that when they say there's no rules to street fights, they mean if a guy confronts me and me and him are going to throw down, no holds barred.
Yeah, you talk about gentleman's rules, right?
There is, in a way.
Yeah, but I mean, okay, look, gentleman's rules are where, for example, two people agree that, you know, if you fall over, I'm not going to kick you in the head or whatever, I'm going to allow you to stand up and fight again. But then that becomes a sanctioned fight. That's not a street fight. That's completely different. And we all understand that.
And if someone's attacking you, they're unlikely to agree to said rules. And ultimately, you have to be able to establish that, whether it's two people settling a difference, and maybe they know each other, or a random attack of violence and you're having to defend yourself against someone whose rules you don't know. You know, it's fair to say that we might know rules among each other, but if you don't know this person and they're attacking you randomly, you can't assume their rules. You have to fight as though they are trying to kill you.
Yes, I agree.
And that's what I think people mean when they say fights are to the death. It's like, I won't be killed, so if I have to kill this guy, that's what will have to happen.
It's a big deal trying to kill a person, though, and I think
I can't imagine.
It's easier said than done. A lot of people think they can do it, but no, it's much easier to say. So that takes us on to justification. Justification is an internal mechanism in which we justify our own behaviour. I can actually live with it. In other words,
yeah, within your worldview, your personal, your inner monologue, you can write the justified story for this situation.
People confuse criminal violence with street fights, and they are completely different events.
Is that because a street fight you knowingly enter into, and a criminal violence situation you are having thrust upon you?
When criminals attack you, it's not a street fight.
Yeah.
Don't define someone that's robbing you or trying to molest or harm you as a street fight. Street fights, by my definition, tend to be ego battles, because I can walk away from those. When someone actually attacks me from a criminal perspective for resources that I may have, be my phone, wallet, or what have you, that is very, very different to an ego battle, to social violence.
Yeah.
And that's the issue I have when we start to define what's fair in a street fight.
Yeah. Whereas a street fight probably starts as an altercation and you both decide, we can only settle this physically.
Exactly.
It's two people making a decision as grown-ups in a way.
Exactly. So you're willingly, because even if it's an ego battle and you don't want to fight, but you're still standing there arguing with someone, you're essentially still enabling the fight.
You're allowing the situation to continue, and ultimately you're a willing participant in the fight. Whereas if you're sucker punched to be robbed, that's a criminal violence situation that you have not entered into.
So what's fair when someone attacks you in your own self-defense to actually harm or take you away? There are no rules, obviously. There are no rules, there's no limitations. That's an obvious statement to make. But it is very different when you're talking about social violence. Because you can have an argument with an 80-year-old man, for example. Is it appropriate to put a baseball bat in the top of his head?
Absolutely not.
No, and I don't know many people will think that's perfectly acceptable and reasonable.
Other than criminal behaviour.
So there's three ways to frame a discussion on what's fair in a street fight. The first thing I'd like you to consider is what's reasonable, and that's an external factor to you.
I guess that word is used in definitions of reasonable force, or what the law states is reasonable given a self-defense situation.
Yeah, so we, by law, have a reasonable force continuum. Regardless of what country you're in, you respond in a fair and proportionate way to the acts of violence against you? What's reasonable? Okay, you're in a fight, you've hit the guy, he's fallen on the ground, then you proceed to stamp on his head.
Unreasonable.
Then you pull out a knife and then you start jimmying away.
Wildly unnecessary.
Is that reasonable or unreasonable?
In the majority of circumstances, it's unreasonable.
Is it a fair fight though?
This is the problem, is the whole idea of the cliche of a fair fight. I think it's too ambiguous and it's too naive.
And that's getting back to when a street fight's fair.
The idea of a fair fight often comes up when you talk about a big guy versus a little guy, or 4 guys versus 1 guy. Fair being, is it proportionate? Is it like a balance? But fair fight when it comes to reasonable force or justified behaviour, I don't think fair is really the right way to describe it.
No, it's not. These factors will be variable from group to group, culture to culture. What might be acceptable for one person or one group of people may not be for another.
Never assume that the rules you have in your mind apply to the person you may encounter.
So when we're talking about group membership, group affiliation, when we're talking about your internal dialogue on how you justify your violence towards another person, these are what you'll define as what's fair, and we all have limitations on this. So the point is, like it or not, there are universal rules that limit our behaviour. Whether you think fights aren't fair and that anything goes and you are going to fight to the death, I guess the reality is that there are no clear-cut rules in a fight. And you can't define that there are no rules, because morally and defensively there are actually always going to be considerations.